Do you remember what it was really like to travel in Great Britain in the 1960s? Ever witnessed that behemoth on the platform? Well, forget the rose-tinted nostalgia. We're diving into the gritty, smoky, but occasionally glamorous reality of British transport in the swinging 60s. Most people think the 60s were a golden age of British cool. But here's the shocking truth. You were more likely to die in a road accident in 1966 than at any other time in British peacetime history. From the death throes of steam to the birth of the motorway age, this is the untold story of how 60s travel shaped modern Britain. Let's start with the railways because, frankly, that's where the real drama was happening. The 1960s marked the most controversial decade in British railway history. And I'm not just talking about British rail sandwiches, though they were criminal enough. Picture yourself on a railway platform in 1960. The air's thick with coal smoke, the distinctive chuff, chuff, chuff of steam engines fills your ears, and suddenly you spot her. The Flying Scotsman, that glorious A3 Pacific locomotive thundering through at 100 miles per hour. Passengers aboard were enjoying proper dining cars with silver service, not the sad excuse for a buffet car we'd see later. The romance of steam was still alive, but barely breathing. Here's what most people don't know. British Railways was hemorrhaging money faster than a cut brake line. By 1961, they were losing £300,000 every single day. That's about £7 million in today's money. Enter Dr. Richard Beeching, a physicist turned axeman whose 1963 report would slash 5,000 miles of track and close 2,363 stations. Entire communities were cut off overnight. Villages that had thrived for a century around their local station became ghost towns. The controversial bit? Beeching's cuts weren't just about money. The government was actively promoting car ownership and road building. They wanted you off the trains and into a shiny new motor. It was a deliberate policy to reshape Britain around the automobile, and they used dodgy accounting to justify it. Many of those unprofitable lines only looked bad because British Railways loaded them with unfair overhead costs. See, while everyone was crying into their coal dust, British Rail was secretly building the future. The West Coast mainline electrification, completed in 1966, was a marvel of engineering that cost £160 million, about £3.5 billion today. The new electric trains could hit 100 miles per hour regularly, not just on special runs. Journey times from London to Manchester dropped from 4 hours to 2.5. But here's the thing nobody mentions: the new trains were soulless. Gone were the individual compartments where you might share gossip with strangers or enjoy a crafty cigarette. The new open-plan carriages felt like hospital waiting rooms. The windows were sealed. No more sticking your head out to feel the wind in your hair. Health and safety had arrived, and it was thoroughly boring. The diesels that replaced steam on other lines were even worse. The notorious Deltic locomotives were powerful, but sounded like a squadron of angry wasps. Passengers complained of headaches from the constant drone. The smell of diesel fumes replaced coal smoke, which somehow felt less romantic and more toxic. Now, if you're enjoying this journey through transport history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because coming up, I'm going to reveal the shocking truth about why British planes in the 60s were actually safer than taking the train. And it's not what you think. The humble bus was how most Britons actually travelled in the 1960s. The iconic Routemaster, introduced in 1956, was reaching peak production. With its open rear platform, you could hop on and off between stops. Dangerous, but convenient. Conductors would swing acrobatically from pole to pole, collecting fares, chatting with regulars, and keeping order among schoolchildren. But here's what made buses special. They were classless. Unlike trains with their first, second and third class carriages, everyone rode the bus together. Company directors sat next to charwomen, debutantes next to dockers. It was one of the few truly democratic spaces in class-obsessed Britain. The controversial part? Bus companies were going broke even faster than railways. Deregulation was already being whispered about in Whitehall corridors. Rural bus services were cut to the bone. One bus on market day if you were lucky. Car ownership was killing buses just as it killed trains, but nobody wanted to admit it because the car industry was creating jobs and tax revenue. Now, let's talk about air travel, because in the 1960s, getting on a plane was nothing like the cattle herding experience we know today. This was the golden age of aviation, when BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, and BEA, British European Airways, ruled the skies, and flying was an event, not an endurance test. Picture yourself at London Airport. Not Heathrow, mind you, because locals still called it London Airport. You're dressed in your finest because flying demanded it. Men wore suits and ties, women wore dresses and heels. The departure lounge looked more like a cocktail party than a waiting room. Smoking was not just allowed, but encouraged. Every seat had its own ashtray. Here's something that'll blow your mind. In the mid-1960s, flying from London to Paris cost roughly half a week's wages for the average worker. The average weekly wage was around £20. So while it seems cheap by today's standards, flying was still for the wealthy. A family holiday to Spain by air would cost several months' wages for the average worker. The planes themselves were magnificent beasts. The Vickers VC-10, Britain's answer to the Boeing 707, had rear-mounted engines that made the cabin whisper quiet. First-class passengers enjoyed beds, actual beds, and 5-course meals served on proper china. Even economy passengers got hot meals, free drinks, and enough legroom to cross their legs without performing gymnastics. But let me share a dirty little secret the airlines didn't advertise: crash statistics. In the mid-1960s, air travel was actually becoming safer, but the public perception was the opposite. Your chances of dying in a plane crash were significantly lower than dying in a car crash. Flying was actually several times safer than driving, but nobody talked about it because the car industry was king. The 1960s were when Britain truly fell in love with the motor car. Car ownership approximately doubled during the decade. The Mini, launched in 1959, became the icon of the 60s. Affordable, cheeky, and quintessentially British. At £497, about £11,000 today, it was within reach of young professionals who wanted their own wheels. But here's what the nostalgia merchants won't tell you. British cars of the 60s were absolute rubbish. The British Motor Corporation's quality control was so bad that workers would sometimes find tools welded inside door panels. Lucas Electrical Systems were so unreliable they earned the nickname Prince of Darkness. The joke went, why do the British drink warm beer? Because Lucas makes their refrigerators. The first 70-mile stretch of the M1 had opened in 1959 with no speed limit. No crash barriers and no hard shoulder. Imagine that, doing 100 miles per hour with oncoming traffic separated by nothing but a grass central reservation. By the mid-60s, the motorway network was expanding rapidly, but it came with a cost. Road deaths peaked at 7,985 in 1966. That's 22 people dying every single day. The driving test in the 60s was a joke compared to today. No theory test, no mandatory lessons, and the practical test lasted about 20 minutes. You could fail 3 times and still not need professional instruction. Is it any wonder the roads were deadly? Yet for all the danger, cars represented freedom. Young people could escape their parents, workers could live further from factories, and families could holiday in Britain without relying on train timetables. The controversial truth? The car killed communities just as surely as Beeching killed railways. Corner shops closed as people drove to new supermarkets. Pubs shut as drink-driving laws tightened. The high street began its long decline. Loving these surprising facts about 1960s travel? Then you'll definitely want to stick around for the section on London Underground, where I'll reveal why they secretly kept running steam trains until 1971, and the horrifying reason why. But first, let's talk about the transport mode that really defined the decade. If cars represented freedom, motorcycles and scooters represented rebellion. The mods and rockers battles of 1964 weren't just about music, they were about transport tribes. Rockers rode proper British bikes, Triumph Bonnevilles, BSA Gold Stars, Norton Commandos. Mods preferred Italian scooters, Vespa and Lambretta, covered in mirrors and lights like Christmas trees on wheels. Here's a fact that'll surprise you. In 1960, Britain was the world's largest exporter of motorcycles. But by the end of the decade, production had collapsed dramatically. Japanese bikes, Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, were more reliable, cheaper, and didn't leak oil on your garage floor. The British bike industry committed suicide through arrogance and poor quality. Riding in the 60s was insanely dangerous. No mandatory helmets until 1973, no protective gear beyond a leather jacket, and bikes with drum brakes that worked about as well as dragging your feet on the ground. The ton-up boys, riders who'd exceeded 100 miles per hour, would race between transport cafes on the newly opened motorways. The Ace Cafe on the North Circular became legendary. They'd put a song on the jukebox, race to a roundabout, and back before it finished. Many didn't make it. Now, about that London Underground secret I promised. While mainline railways were ditching steam, some lines quietly kept steam locomotives running on freight services well into the 1960s. Why? Because the ancient tunnels couldn't handle diesel fumes without killing passengers. They literally couldn't modernise without rebuilding half the network. The tube in the 60s was a fascinating contradiction. The Victoria Line, opened in 1968, was the world's first automatic underground railway. Drivers were just there to open doors and reassure nervous passengers. It was space-age technology running through Victorian tunnels. Meanwhile, most other lines still used trains from the 1930s, with no air conditioning and windows you could actually open, essential when packed into a metal tube with 500 sweating commuters. Here's the horrifying bit. The King's Cross fire of 1987 that killed 31 people. The conditions that caused it were already present in the 1960s. Wooden escalators soaked in decades of oil and grease, no sprinkler systems, and staff who weren't trained for emergencies. There were several small fires throughout the 60s that were hushed up. The London Transport Board knew the system was a death trap but kept quiet to avoid panic and costly upgrades. The Thames wasn't just a river in the 1960s, it was a highway. Regular passenger services ran from Westminster to Greenwich, carrying commuters who preferred a civilised boat ride to the sardine tin experience of the tube. The boats were proper vessels with polished brass and varnished wood, not the plastic tourist tubs of today. Here's what killed Thames Transport, the Clean Air Act of 1956. Sounds mad, doesn't it? But when London's fog cleared, people could actually see how filthy the Thames was. The Great Stink might have been a Victorian memory, but the river in the 60s was essentially an open sewer. Passengers stopped wanting to cruise through the stench, and services dwindled to tourist routes only. London's black cabs in the 1960s were transitioning from the ancient Austin FX3 to the modern FX4. The classic shape we still recognise today. Cabbies still had to pass the knowledge, memorising 25,000 streets and 20,000 landmarks. No sat-navs, no radios even. You hailed a cab or found one at a rank. The dirty secret of 1960s cabs. Many drivers were absolutely coining it. With no credit cards and minimal oversight, cash was king. The taxman rarely saw accurate accounts. A cabbie working the West End could earn more than a bank manager, tax-free. The authorities knew but turned a blind eye because cabs were essential to London's economy. The 1960s invented the modern commute as we know it. The combination of motorways, electrified railways and suburban sprawl created the commuter belt. Every morning, armies of bowler-hatted men would converge on London from dormitory towns across the home counties. British Rail even created a new class for them, intercity. These weren't your grandfather's trains. They had airline-style seats, carpeted floors, and buffet cars serving British Rail's infamous coffee, which one comedian described as an interesting way of spoiling water. The psychological toll was brutal. Men, and it was mostly men, would leave home at 6 a.m, returning after 8 p.m, seeing their children only on weekends. The three-martini lunch became standard practice, not because businessmen were alcoholics, but because they needed something to numb the soul-crushing routine. The 1960s revolutionised how ordinary Britons holidayed. Before, it was Blackpool or Brighton if you were lucky. Suddenly, package holidays to Spain became affordable. Operators like Thomson and Horizon offered 2 weeks in Benidorm for less than 2 months' wages, about £700 in today's money. Entire factories would save together and block book flights. The culture clash was spectacular. Pale Britons who'd never seen olive oil outside a chemist suddenly confronted paella, sangria, and topless sunbathing. Hotels learned to serve chips with everything and stock HP sauce. The Spanish learned 2 essential English phrases: full English breakfast and last orders please. Here's the dark side nobody discusses. Many of those early charter flights were on ancient propeller planes bought cheap from defunct airlines. Safety standards were theoretical. Pilots were often ex-military, more used to bombing runs than passenger comfort. When Dan Air Flight 1903 crashed near Barcelona in July 1970, killing all 112 people aboard, the investigation revealed the airline was using navigational charts from years earlier. The package holiday boom was built on calculated risks with passengers' lives. The 1960s transformed British travel forever. We gained speed, but lost soul. We found freedom, but created pollution. The bitter irony. Many of those unprofitable railway lines Beeching axed are desperately needed today. Those utopian motorways delivered gridlock. The car-centric planning that seemed so modern left us with dead town centres and isolation. But the biggest change was psychological. Travel stopped being special and became routine. When everyone could fly to Spain, it stopped being an adventure. The democratization of travel, that great 1960s achievement, also killed its magic. Modern Britain was built on transport decisions made by men who thought cars were the future and communities were expendable. We're still living with their choices. If you've enjoyed this journey through 1960s British transport, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Our next video explores what shopping was really like before supermarkets conquered Britain, including why rationing didn't really end until the 1960s. Drop your 1960s travel stories in the comments below. Whether it's surviving a British rail sandwich or taking your first package holiday, we want to hear about it. Because while statistics tell us about passenger miles, only your memories can bring that incredible decade back to life. Cheers.